it is impossible to understand the ferocity, discipline, and self-destructive courage of the Japanese forces in World War II without traveling back to the origins of a much older idea, an idea that began not in the factories and barracks of modern Japan but in the mist-covered landscapes of its feudal past. Imagine a society shaped for centuries by warriors who believed that honor lived beyond life and death, that loyalty was worth more than breath, and that courage demanded silence even in the face of agony. This was Bushido, the way of the warrior, a philosophy that began as a quiet code among samurai but eventually transformed into a national ideology powerful enough to guide a modern empire into one of the deadliest wars in history. Long before airplanes roared over the Pacific or tanks rolled across Asia, the samurai walked Japan's provinces with a strict sense of duty engraved into their souls. But unlike the Hollywood image of sword-wielding fighters, the samurai were also administrators, poets, thinkers, and spiritual seekers. Their code didn't appear in a single book or moment, it developed slowly, century after century, shaped by the land's religion and philosophy. Zen Buddhism taught them fearlessness and calmness before death. Shintoism taught devotion, purity, and loyalty to their divine ruler. Confucianism insisted on hierarchy, duty, and absolute obedience. Together, these influences formed a silent moral system that told the samurai how to live and how to die, an inner compass that pointed not toward survival but toward honor. When the age of samurai began fading in the late 1800s, many believed Bushido would disappear with them. Japan had entered the era of the Meiji Restoration, when the nation rushed to modernize, industrialize, and compete with Western powers. Feudalism was abolished, swords were banned in public, and the samurai lost their privileged status. It seemed that the warrior spirit would dissolve into history. But something very different happened. Instead of vanishing, Bushido was resurrected, this time not as a personal moral code but as a national identity, redesigned intentionally by the state. The government realized it needed a unifying ideology to bind a rapidly modernizing population, and Bushido offered exactly that: discipline, sacrifice, loyalty, and a historical narrative that portrayed Japan as unique and superior. School textbooks suddenly began praising samurai values as the true spirit of the Japanese people. Children recited moral lessons that glorified self-discipline and unquestioning loyalty to the emperor. Stories of ancient warriors and noble suicides became essential tools in shaping young minds. The message was simple and repeated endlessly: dying for your country was the highest honor, and loyalty to the emperor was not only patriotic but sacred. As these ideas spread into classrooms, newspapers, and public ceremonies, Bushido transformed from a private warrior ethic into a powerful psychological force, one that prepared an entire generation to accept sacrifice without hesitation. By the early 20th century, Japan's leaders began to realize that Bushido could serve another purpose: it could become the emotional engine behind the nation's military expansion. As Japan invaded Korea, Manchuria, and later China, military officials and propagandists twisted Bushido into something far harsher than what the samurai had once lived by. The original code valued honor, justice, and self-control. The modern reinterpretation valued unquestioning obedience, aggression, and the belief that life itself was expendable. Death before surrender became a national motto. Soldiers were taught that being captured was not merely a failure but a disgrace that stained their families. In samurai tradition, defeat could be met with ritual suicide. In the military's version, defeat was impossible because a true Japanese spirit never acknowledged it. Such psychological conditioning made it easier for commanders to push soldiers into impossible assaults and for ordinary recruits to accept unimaginable suffering as part of their duty. Inside Japan's military training camps, the Bushido mindset hardened to an extreme. Training was brutal, designed to crush individuality and replace it with discipline bordering on fanaticism. Recruits endured beatings for minor mistakes, starvation as punishment, and drills meant to destroy fear and encourage absolute obedience. They were taught to endure pain without flinching, to never question orders, and to see emotional expression as weakness. The result was a soldier who saw death not as something to fear, but as a duty. Bushido had become not merely a philosophy but a weapon, a tool that made Japan's military terrifyingly resilient and emotionally unbreakable. At the center of this ideological transformation stood the emperor, Hirohito, who was portrayed as a divine figure descended from heavenly ancestors. In traditional Bushido, loyalty to one's lord was sacred. In modern Japan, that loyalty was redirected entirely toward the emperor. Every soldier was taught that serving the emperor was a spiritual act and that dying in his name was the highest path to honor. This belief had a staggering psychological power. It meant that military commands were not merely orders but sacred instructions. To disobey was unthinkable. To retreat was shameful. To die was glorious. By the time World War II approached, Japan had created a society in which Bushido wasn't just admired, it was expected. It infiltrated schools, homes, military barracks, newspapers, films, and even children's songs. It shaped how soldiers marched, how civilians endured hardship, and how leaders justified aggression. Japan's political and military strategy was no longer driven only by weapons and tactics but by an emotional and spiritual engine that demanded sacrifice. Bushido had evolved from a samurai philosophy into the psychological foundation of an empire preparing for war. This transformation would soon shape battlefields across the Pacific, influencing not only how Japanese soldiers fought but how they lived, endured, and died. And as the world would soon discover, an army fueled by the belief that death is preferable to surrender becomes one of the most unpredictable and formidable forces imaginable. When World War II erupted, the world expected Japan to fight with determination. What no one truly anticipated was the extraordinary intensity with which Japanese soldiers threw themselves into combat. Their behavior puzzled, shocked, and ultimately terrified Allied forces. It wasn't just discipline or nationalism that drove them, it was something far deeper and older, something carved into the collective psyche of a generation raised under an unforgiving warrior creed. Bushido, which had once guided samurai in duels and palace intrigues, became an invisible force shaping how every Japanese soldier fought, endured hardship, and ultimately embraced the idea of dying with purpose. The battlefield became a theater where ancient ideas collided violently with modern machinery, and the results were unlike anything the Allied commanders had ever seen. From the very beginning of the Pacific conflict, Allied troops noticed that Japanese soldiers would fight long after logic suggested retreat. A bunker that should have surrendered kept firing until the last man fell. A defensive line that appeared broken suddenly erupted in a counterattack by soldiers who knew they were marching toward death. The familiar rules of war where survival, regrouping, and tactical withdrawal were normal seemed meaningless to men who had been taught from childhood that honor mattered more than life. This created a paradox. Japan did not necessarily possess the best weapons or the strongest economic base, but its soldiers often acted with a sense of personal responsibility so extreme that it blurred the line between bravery and self-destruction. Inside foxholes and trenches, the psychology shaped by Bushido revealed itself in quiet ways too. Wounded soldiers refused medical evacuation, insisting their place was among their comrades, not in the safety of a hospital tent. Even in the face of overwhelming firepower, they carried themselves with a resolve that sometimes felt eerie to opponents. Letters found on the bodies of fallen Japanese soldiers often spoke of devotion to family and emperor, but almost never of fear. Instead, they talked about obligation, expectations, and dignity, concepts drilled into them through years of cultural pressure. In the modern world, it was unusual to see soldiers internalize a sense of duty so absolute that the thought of survival felt like a betrayal. One of the clearest manifestations of Bushido on the battlefield was the refusal to surrender. The Allies were mystified by how rare it was to capture Japanese troops alive. Even when surrounded, starving, or severely wounded, Japanese soldiers typically chose death over captivity. Sometimes this meant making a final charge with bayonet or sword. A desperate rush meant not to win but to die meaningfully. Other times it meant pulling the pin on a grenade held close to one's chest. This behavior wasn't the product of battlefield panic but of deeper conditioning that insisted capture was shameful. Allied units soon learned that approaching a Japanese soldier to accept his surrender was dangerous. Many feigned surrender only to detonate explosives or attack at the last moment, believing that taking an enemy with them redeemed their own defeat. This extreme resistance created uniquely brutal combat conditions. Battles dragged on far longer than anticipated because each Japanese unit fought almost to extinction. The jungles and mountains of the Pacific were littered with caves, tunnels, and hidden positions from which Japanese soldiers launched last stands. They chose terrain that allowed them to hold out for weeks, even months, with minimal supplies. The resilience came not just from training but from a philosophical belief that retreat was dishonorable and surrender was unforgivable. Commanders, too, planned strategies around this mentality. Orders often demanded that the troops defend their positions to the last man, instructions treated as sacred commands rather than tactical suggestions. Even more disturbing to the Allies was the Japanese willingness to engage in actions that bordered on suicidal but were carried out with calm deliberation. The famous banzai charges, often misunderstood as chaotic rushes, were in many cases carefully organized attacks meant to break enemy lines through sheer ferocity. Hundreds of soldiers would storm positions while shouting ancestral phrases, charging through machine gun fire with almost ritualistic devotion. These charges rarely succeeded strategically, yet they left a psychological mark on Allied troops, who struggled to understand how human beings could embrace death so openly. To the Japanese soldiers, however, such charges were not wasteful, they were opportunities to die with purpose, to fulfill the expectations of their culture, officers, and ancestors. Japanese soldiers were also known for their ability to endure conditions that would break most armies. On islands where food and water ran out, they continued fighting with shocking resilience, sometimes surviving on insects, leaves, or almost nothing at all. Disease, exhaustion, and hunger did not weaken their resolve in the way commanders on the other side expected. Bushido encouraged mental and physical discipline that transformed suffering into a form of resistance. Many diary entries from Japanese soldiers show an acceptance of hardship that feels almost otherworldly, as if the struggle itself strengthened their resolve. This wasn't simply patriotism, it was the internal voice of a philosophy that taught endurance as an essential component of honor. Interrogations of the few Japanese prisoners whom Allied forces did manage to capture revealed another layer of Bushido's impact. Most prisoners expressed deep shame, sometimes begging for execution because living as a captive felt unbearable. They worried not only about their reputation but about how their families would perceive their survival. Some believed their parents would disown them, others feared they had tarnished their entire family lineage. Such responses highlighted the cultural depth of the ideology the Allies faced. This wasn't a temporary wartime propaganda effect but a deeply rooted cultural expectation that survival could be more painful than death. Bushido also shaped Japanese decision-making at the command level. Officers shared the same values as their soldiers and often carried the expectations even further. High-ranking commanders sometimes chose mass suicides instead of retreat. Entire units disappeared in ceremonies where soldiers apologized to their ancestors, shared farewell drinks, and then took their own lives as a final act of loyalty. These events weren't acts of desperation but carefully executed rituals that reflected the way Bushido had fused with national identity. For many Japanese commanders, the battlefield wasn't merely a place to win or lose but a stage to demonstrate moral integrity, even in defeat. The Allied military eventually understood that defeating Japan would require more than tactical superiority. They were fighting not just an army but a mindset, a worldview that turned ordinary men into warriors who valued death more than surrender. This realization shaped Allied strategy, expectations, and even the decision-making that ultimately concluded the war. But on the ground, in the mud, jungle, and smoke, Bushido's influence played out in countless individual acts of defiance, courage, and sacrifice that made the Pacific War one of the harshest and most unyielding conflicts the world had ever seen. Skyfall of devotion, kamikaze, and the civilian descent into Bushido's harshest extremes. By the later years of World War II, Japan's military leadership found itself confronting a bleak reality. The empire that once seemed unstoppable was now shrinking under the pressure of relentless Allied advances. Island after island had fallen, supply lines were collapsing, and the industrial capacity of the nation was buckling under the weight of constant bombardment. Yet even as defeat drew closer, something extraordinary, and to many observers, incomprehensible began to unfold in the skies and towns of Japan. It was as if the entire nation had been swept into a final storm of devotion, where both soldiers and civilians embraced acts that defied common sense yet made perfect sense within the unforgiving logic of Bushido. It was during this period that the world witnessed the rise of the kamikaze and the tragic unraveling of civilian life shaped by a belief system pushed to its harshest limits. For most Allied pilots and sailors, the first encounters with kamikaze attacks felt unreal. They watched in shock as Japanese planes, sometimes burning or trailing smoke, didn't attempt evasive maneuvers or retreat but instead curved deliberately toward their ships in a deadly arc. These pilots were not acting out of desperation or madness, they were executing carefully planned missions that required intense preparation, emotional resolve, and an unwavering belief that their death carried a special meaning. To the outside world, these suicide attacks seemed like acts of hopelessness, but to the pilots who carried them out, they were portrayed as acts of sacred service. Their commanders framed the missions as a final opportunity to give everything they had for their nation, tapping into a cultural reservoir that celebrated sacrifice as the most honorable path one could take. Inside the training bases designated for these missions, the atmosphere was unlike any conventional military installation. Pilots attended intimate gatherings where they shared heartfelt letters, photographs, and small tokens with friends. Ceremonial cups of sake were passed around, not in a mood of despair but in a calm acceptance that they were about to participate in something viewed as noble. Many wrote to their families not with fear or regret but with a strange blend of pride and resignation, expressing hope that their final act would protect the homeland. Commanders deliberately cultivated this emotional environment, reminding them that the homeland stood on the brink and that their deaths could shift the tide of the war. Even the youngest volunteers internalized a sense of urgency that transcended self-preservation. But kamikaze missions were only one dimension of the extreme manifestations of Bushido during this period. On the ground, Japanese civilians were caught in a psychological storm that shaped their actions in ways that historians still struggle to fully understand. Propaganda, fear, and cultural expectations intertwined to create an atmosphere where ordinary people began to see the possibility of death as a logical alternative to capture. Government broadcasts repeatedly warned civilians that Allied troops would torture and kill them, painting the enemy as inhuman monsters. At the same time, families were reminded through schools, posters, and radio programs that dying with dignity was better than living in humiliation. This combination of fear and pride created a powerful emotional trap that left civilians feeling they had only one way to protect their honor. On islands such as Saipan and Okinawa, this psychological environment turned devastating. Civilians who had spent their entire lives working farms or fishing along the coast suddenly found themselves surrounded by battle. When Japanese soldiers retreated into the hills or caves, many families followed, believing that remaining with the military was safer than facing the invading forces. As the fighting intensified and defeat became inevitable, a tragic pattern emerged. Instead of seeking refuge or waving white flags, some civilians gathered near cliffs or secluded areas where families made the heartbreaking choice to end their lives together. Parents held their children in their arms as they jumped, convinced that this was the only way to prevent worse suffering. These deaths were not spontaneous acts of panic but the fatal outcome of years of indoctrination, emotional fear, and a belief system that taught that honor could be lost even in circumstances beyond one's control. The psychological burden carried by civilians during this time was immense. Mothers feared that if they survived while their husbands or sons died in battle, they would be judged harshly by their communities. Children were taught in school that surrender was unthinkable, leaving them unable to imagine a world beyond the war's propaganda. Even elderly men and women felt compelled to contribute in whatever way they could. Some fashioned bamboo spears and prepared to charge at invading soldiers, convinced they should at least attempt resistance rather than wait passively. The government distributed instructions for last resort defense, urging civilians to turn household tools into weapons and to confront enemy soldiers without hesitation. The result was not an effective militia but a society caught in a collective psychological breakdown, driven by an ideology that demanded courage even when courage became self-destruction. Meanwhile, within the military hierarchy, decisions grew increasingly extreme. Commanders ordered entire garrisons to fight without the slightest expectation of survival. Messages were broadcast encouraging both soldiers and civilians to embrace decisive death rather than endure the shame of defeat. Some officers, realizing the hopelessness of their situation, performed ritual suicides in front of their units. These acts were meant to inspire the troops, but they also transmitted an unspoken message: leadership no longer imagined survival as a possible outcome. Instead, they envisioned a final stand in which sacrifice itself became the strategy. In this climate, kamikaze missions expanded dramatically, with students from universities and high schools volunteering to take part. For many of them, the war had consumed their entire adolescence, and they saw no future beyond it. Their letters, preserved today in museums, show young men grappling with the weight of expectations but ultimately accepting their fate with quiet resolve. What made these events even more tragic was the disparity between Japan's internal narrative and the reality unfolding around it. As cities burned under aerial bombardment and supply chains disintegrated, many civilians continued believing that victory was possible through sheer spiritual strength. This belief was reinforced by news reports designed to hide the extent of losses. Even when the situation became catastrophic, the idea that the spirit of the Japanese people could triumph over physical disadvantage persisted. Bushido had become more than a moral code, it had become a psychological defense mechanism that shielded individuals from the crushing realization that defeat was imminent. But this shield came at a terrible cost, leading many to decisions that cut short lives that could have been saved. The closing stages of the war thus revealed the darkest side of a culture shaped by unyielding expectations. Kamikaze pilots soared into the sky with calm determination, convinced that their deaths carried meaning beyond the battlefield. Civilians faced impossible choices shaped by fear, pride, and decades of indoctrination. And in the shadows of shattered towns and burning fields, the weight of Bushido pressed down on a nation caught between centuries of tradition and the brutal realities of modern warfare. It was a moment when devotion, taken to its extreme, no longer protected the homeland but consumed it from within. Echoes after the silence, Japan's struggle to rebuild identity in the shadow of Bushido. When the final bombs stopped falling and Japan lay in stunned silence beneath a sky thick with smoke and fear, the country confronted a reality more daunting than any battlefield it had faced. The empire that once marched confidently across continents had collapsed completely, leaving behind shattered cities, starving citizens, and a society emotionally fractured by years of relentless sacrifice. Yet among the rubble, one of the most complicated challenges Japan now faced was not material reconstruction, it was the task of redefining itself. For decades, Bushido had shaped how people understood loyalty, courage, purpose, and even death. Now, with the emperor renouncing his divine status and allied forces occupying the nation, the entire moral compass of Japan seemed to spin without direction. The very ideology that had once commanded national devotion suddenly felt out of place in a world that demanded peace, humility, and honest reflection. In the first months following surrender, Japanese civilians moved through their towns like survivors of a long fever dream. The propaganda that had once shaped their worldview evaporated almost overnight, leaving behind confusion and grief. Families searched for loved ones who had never returned. Mothers unfolded letters written by sons who believed they were dying for glory. Now those letters felt unbearably heavy. Many people struggled with a quiet shame, wondering if devotion taken too far had betrayed them. For soldiers returning home, the emotional transition was even more jarring. Men who had been raised to believe that courage meant embracing death were suddenly told that survival was all that mattered. Those who had resisted surrender until the very last moment were expected to adapt to a world in which honor no longer demanded sacrifice but cooperation. It was as if an entire generation had to relearn the meaning of life itself. One of the most profound shifts came with the emperor's declaration that he was not divine. For years, his perceived spiritual authority had anchored Bushido-inspired loyalty. When he stood before the nation and spoke words that dismantled centuries of myth, people listened in stunned disbelief. This single announcement ushered in a psychological earthquake. Some wept, not because they were disappointed, but because the foundation on which they had built their identity had dissolved. Others felt relief, as though a weight of impossible expectations had finally been lifted. But almost everyone understood that Japan could never return to what it had been. The ideology that had guided them into war could not guide them into the future. The Allied occupation further accelerated this transformation. Schools, once centers of nationalist indoctrination, were forced to abandon militaristic teachings. In classrooms that had once echoed with lessons of duty and sacrifice, children now studied democratic principles and the value of individual rights. Teachers who had spent years repeating state-mandated slogans struggled to adjust, often stumbling to find new ways of speaking about patriotism without invoking the language of honor and death. Many young students felt caught between two worlds, raised by parents shaped by Bushido but pushed into a new society that encouraged free thought, ambition, and personal happiness. The generational divide widened quickly, creating tension at dinner tables and in neighborhoods where older residents clung to certain values even as the younger generation moved forward. Across the nation, artists, writers, and intellectuals also began to re-examine the cultural wounds left behind. Literature from the post-war years often grappled with themes of loss, disillusionment, and moral awakening. Some authors explored the psychological toll of blind loyalty, while others attempted to reinterpret Bushido in gentler terms, emphasizing personal discipline and integrity rather than extreme sacrifice. These works stirred conversations about responsibility, both individual and collective. People wanted to understand how a philosophy once associated with elegance and self-control had evolved into something capable of fueling such devastation. Yet amid the questioning, there were also earnest attempts to salvage aspects of Bushido that could coexist with peace. Concepts like sincerity, perseverance, and respect gradually resurfaced, stripped of their darkest wartime interpretations. Meanwhile, the international community observed Japan with a mixture of sympathy, caution, and curiosity. Many countries struggled to reconcile the ferocity of Japan's wartime behavior with the humility of its post-war stance. Some scholars abroad examined Bushido as an anthropological phenomenon, tracing its evolution and trying to understand how cultural ideals could shape national policy so profoundly. Newspapers across the world published reports describing the discipline with which Japan approached its reconstruction, noting how the same cultural traits that once fueled war were now driving economic reform and societal stability. Yet beneath this admiration was a lingering unease. The memory of wartime brutality, especially in Asia, remained raw. For many, Bushido had become symbolic of a dangerous ideology capable of transforming devotion into destruction. Inside Japan, debates about accountability emerged. Some argued that the military leadership had distorted Bushido beyond recognition, using it as a tool to manipulate soldiers and civilians. Others believed that the philosophy itself contained seeds that made such manipulation possible. Trials of wartime officials forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths. Testimonies revealed how orders were enforced, how expectations were communicated, and how fear and honor had intertwined to push individuals toward extreme choices. For many citizens, listening to these accounts brought clarity but also sorrow. They recognized that bravery, when stripped of humanity, could become cruelty, and that discipline, when fused with fanaticism, could destroy even the strongest communities. Yet despite the emotional turbulence, Japan began to rebuild with remarkable determination. As factories reopened and trade routes revived, a new national ethos emerged, one centered not on conquest but on creation. Workers took pride in craftsmanship, students pursued knowledge with fresh enthusiasm, and families focused on stability rather than sacrifice. Curiously, some elements of Bushido resurfaced in unexpected ways. The dedication to excellence, perseverance through hardship, and respect for duty reappeared in Japan's economic and social renewal. But this time, these values fueled growth rather than violence. The philosophy had been stripped of its wartime shadows and reimagined as a quiet force for self-improvement. By the time Japan entered its era of rapid industrial growth, the world had begun to see it through a new lens. The nation that once unleashed kamikaze pilots now produced technology admired across the globe. The culture once associated with rigid loyalty now embraced creativity and innovation. And yet, beneath the modern surface, echoes of the old code lingered, transformed but unmistakable. Bushido had not vanished, it had evolved. It no longer demanded lives on the battlefield but instead guided individuals toward resilience, discipline, and purpose in peaceful ways. In the end, Japan's post-war journey revealed something profound about the power of cultural ideals. A philosophy that once inspired warriors to fight without fear had also left deep scars when misused. But through reflection and reinvention, the same cultural spirit helped the nation rise from destruction. The legacy of Bushido became neither a source of blind pride nor a relic of shame, but a reminder that even the most ancient traditions must be adapted carefully, or they risk consuming those who follow them. And in the quiet streets of a rebuilt Japan, this understanding shaped